So, flashback to September 2015. A bunch of college students made a groundbreaking discovery. After testing multiple Volkswagen vehicles, specifically diesel-powered ones, they found out that Volkswagen diesels were cheating emissions tests. This shook the auto industry and led to jail time, sweeping reforms, and billions in lawsuits, fines, buybacks, and more. However, if you dig deeper, you realize that this wasn't and still isn't a uniquely Volkswagen problem. But before we go any further, let's just figure out what happened with Volkswagen and then take a look at other brands who are just as guilty. So, this actually starts in 2013, when a group of researchers from the University of West Virginia were awarded a grant to help find new ways of performing emissions tests on vehicles. What these researchers did with this money would change the automotive industry forever. They got their hands on 2 diesel Volkswagens and a diesel BMW, and took them on long-term emissions tests by driving them around the California area. The final car that they chose, the Volkswagen Passat, they drove from Los Angeles to Seattle and back, and what they found was shocking. The BMW passed with flying colors and had no issues whatsoever. However, the Volkswagen passed in the same way that Epstein actually killed himself. They both just didn't. Both the Volkswagens failed, and they failed bad. Both Volkswagen cars tested failed by anywhere from going 5 to 35 times over the legal emissions limit, which is just ridiculous. Essentially, how Volkswagen got away with it for so long was, the car would detect when it was on a test device and drastically cut back on emissions. But when it was just driving around day to day, it would be spewing ridiculous amounts of extra emissions into the air. And it's not like this only affected 1 or 2 model years, as these cars had these defeat devices in them going all the way back to 2009 and going all the way up to 2015. And this affected 11 million cars. So to say this was a big deal would be an understatement. At first, believe it or not, Volkswagen actually denied that there was anything wrong and chalked it up to mere glitches in the testing software. That's really difficult to believe, but okay. However, after undeniable evidence surfaced from multiple government agencies all over the world, they just couldn't deny it any longer. Well, that and the EPA threatened to not approve any VW Group models from the 2016 model year. Anyways, in late 2015, the board of directors at the VW Group admitted that they did install defeat devices and showed the EPA exactly how they worked. And keep in mind, this didn't just affect the US, as multiple European countries, Australia, and more were affected by the scandal. And in the end, it cost Volkswagen more than $30 billion. However, despite what mainstream media and other auto manufacturers may have wanted you to think, this scandal was not special to only Volkswagen. See, Fiat Chrysler, now Stellantis, also found itself in some very hot water with the EPA, as its eco-diesel engines found in the Ram 1500 and briefly the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Sidetrack, I may not like anything Jeep after AMC got rid of it, but god, that Jeep Wrangler eco-diesel is so cool. A diesel Wrangler is definitely on the dream car list. Anyways, this was a considerable amount of time after Dieselgate broke. Specifically, this all happened in 2017. So what happened was the EPA sent a letter to FCA essentially telling them, we caught you breaking emissions. Now it is obviously much more complicated than that, as they weren't technically accused of breaking emissions, but everyone knew. So essentially after that, they went to court for not only criminal charges, but also a whole slew of lawsuits. But the big lawsuit filed by the US government, that one was resolved in the form of a $311 million settlement that was to be paid to the EPA and California's CARB. And they had to recall all affected vehicles and repair them. But that's not the end of it though, as like I said before, they were also facing criminal charges, and board members were convicted of violating the Clean Air Act and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, which landed FCA a further $301 million fine. And keep in mind, all of that was just in the US. As in the UK, they face an ongoing $5 billion lawsuit for all their brand's diesel engines effectively doing the same thing and cheating emissions. However, the case is ongoing, so there isn't much information. But speaking of ongoing diesel emission cases, Mercedes-Benz has allegedly been caught cheating emissions in their Blue Tech diesel SUVs, with the defeat devices detecting when it's being tested and cleverly disengaging for 16 miles, which is an awfully big coincidence, as that is the standard distance for an emissions test. However, regulators in the US, Germany, and the UK have begun to catch on, and lawsuits started flying in 2018. In all of them, Mercedes-Benz continues to deny any wrongdoing. Now, there isn't much to report on. As I previously said, almost all the cases are still ongoing in these countries, so all of this is alleged. However, in Germany, a verdict has been delivered on one of the lawsuits, and Merck has to pay 870 million euros for not fully complying with emissions regulations. It's estimated that in Germany alone, up to 700,000 diesel SUVs could be affected by defeat devices. So something that may be helpful to understand how all of these diesel scandals got to the point that they did is to realize the fact that the big 3 German brands, BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen, all allegedly colluded together to help each other find new ways to defeat emissions tests. And for whatever reason, this next one's really weird, they also colluded to find new ways to make their engines engines produce less emissions and be more efficient, but then proceeded to not use said technology. And this very much angered the German government, who fined BMW and Volkswagen 1 billion euros each, but not Mercedes, because even though Mercedes was just as guilty as the rest of them, they snitched, and that was their reward. They got off scot-free. So there you go, kids. Not only do snitches not get stitches, but you also get indirectly subsidized $1 billion and a free pass to do whatever you want from the German government. I wonder what happened last time Mercedes got a free pass from the... I'm sorry. Anyways, but that's not all, as BMW also has an ongoing lawsuit filed in 2018 that alleges that they've been using emission defeat devices to spew more emissions than necessary. However, not much is available on the case from what I gathered from my research, and that case is still ongoing. Another German brand, and probably the most boring German brand in existence, Opel. Now, for such a boring brand, they had a very clever way of cheating emissions. See, on their front-wheel drive diesel vehicles, where the two front wheels were turning and the two rear ones were stationary, which by the way is what happens during an emissions test, the engine would kick into test mode and cut back on emissions. But when the vehicle detected all four wheels were spinning, it would go back to default mode and spew black death clouds everywhere that killed millions of babies and puppies and your whole family. At least that's what most media outlets portrayed it as. Now, by this point, Germany was pretty fed up finding out that all their brands were cheating emissions, and similar to an alcoholic stepdad, they took their anger out on one of their children, and it just so happened to be the red-headed stepchild in the form of Opel, as their HQ actually got raided by German authorities to try and find evidence of them cheating emissions. And furthermore, they were caught by Belgian news outlets reflashing ECUs with new tunes to cut back on emissions without customers knowing, which is a very big no-no. It's estimated that anywhere from 60,000 to 300,000 Opel cars may have been affected, and honestly, I have no idea whatever came of it, or if charges have been filed, if cases are ongoing, or anything, because every article I've read and researched on Opel says like 2 sentences about Opel, then does a deep dive on VW's Dieselgate. If anyone has any information or any articles out there, please let me know in the comments below. So with all of these brands all over the world cheating diesel emissions, why was Volkswagen caught in the crosshairs? Well, the biggest reason was the amount of VW cars that had been affected, which was over 11 million worldwide, whereas none of the other brands even broke 1 million affected cars. Still, there is startlingly very little information regarding any of the aforementioned brands and their diesel emission violations, especially since it was found out that over in Europe, 1 year after Dieselgate broke, that not one single brand over there that offered a diesel vehicle in their lineup was meeting emission standards set by the EU. Now, I am a massive hypocrite, I have to say, as for the longest time, I've endorsed and still kind of do endorse rolling coal and tuning diesel engines, but I think, and this is just my opinion, that there's just a little difference between Reginald from Mississippi tuning his 06 Duramax and Volkswagen knowingly tuning 11 million vehicles to spew out emissions that they could have easily just not done. Anyways, getting back on track, just because these car companies didn't have 11 million cars violating laws doesn't mean that they're any better, as stuff like this only feeds ammo to knuckle-dragging moron Tesla owners. And finding him $330 million is the equivalent of giving someone like you or me a speeding ticket. We'd be a little upset about it, yeah, and those points might be a little bit of a pain to deal with in the future, but at the end of the day, it's hardly a real punishment.